Before we start into today's episode, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Kyndryl. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a huge blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed services capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find our friends Kyndryl at www.kyndryl.com. I'm going to start today's episode with the dedications from the book because they speak to the very heart of this show. Hippocrates first famously said, "All diseases begin in the gut." And then a hero of this show, Ignaz Semmelweis, who died for questioning his medical school professors at the Vienna General Hospital as to the real cause of childbed fever. Prior to the discovery of bacteria, he correctly identified the cause as a lack of hand sterilizing, doctors not washing their hands after touching dead bodies beforehand. But his practice was soundly repudiated by his peers. For his insights, he was declared a quack, deported to Budapest, and placed in an asylum where he was beaten to death. 15 years later, with the discovery of bacteria, his insights were proven, and his place as the father of antisepsis heralded around the world. May he rest in peace. Why am I talking about that? People may wonder what today's book has to do with innovation, but what is so important on this show is learning. And if you can learn effectively, if you have the right terrain, that's an important word we're going to talk about. The terrain is the environment, or even more correctly, the ecosystem in your gut. We need that in a state of homeostasis in order to learn effectively, for synaptic plasticity to influence neurogenesis and ultimately to lead a happier life. Today's book is written by a change maker, which is why I opened with those brilliant quotes. Pioneers take the arrows, and it is a pleasure to welcome a man who's taken many arrows and is a pioneer, a prolific author who has a great podcast himself and is the author of his brand new book, The Gut-Brain Paradox. Stephen Gundry, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for all those nice words. You know, one of the great American humorists, Mark Twain, was introduced with glowing words at a meeting, and he said, I thank you for all those nice words, but I don't deserve them. I also have arthritis, and I don't deserve that either, so I'll take it.
Nice, John. You haven't heard that as a retort for an intro on this show before. It's great to have you on the show, man. And I know you're under time pressure because you're still practicing. You still see miracles. What you used to think were miracles in your practice all the time. Now you see what the turnarounds are. Let's start with a couple of those turnarounds you mentioned in the book. The lady with Parkinson's, the former athlete who developed POTS. Let's tell our audience about that because this will set the tone.
Sure. And in fact, the lady with Parkinson's is a great story because I have a follow-up, which is, I think, very enlightening. And it speaks to what, for some people, it's so difficult to achieve a balanced, homeostatic inner terrain. One of our famous or infamous politicians, Hillary Clinton, once wrote a book called It Takes a Village. And it really takes a village of this incredible tropical rainforest that should exist in our gut, that if we can get a balanced tropical rainforest, the terrain as was described in the Pasteur wars, then we can fix a lot of things. So this is a woman, she's actually a physician, 62 years old, who, an athlete, she was a marathon runner, and she developed Parkinson's, fairly severe, about 5 years before I met her. And she was from Northern California, and she came to my office in Southern California, and her husband did most of the talking. She had a blank face, the mask of Parkinson's, and she had pretty impressive tremors, even on 2 medications. And we, as part of our workup for most of our patients, we look at autoimmune markers and also leaky gut markers. And for a lot of our patients now, we look at their microbiome and who's in there, what are they producing, what neurotransmitters they're producing. Anyway, so this lady had wide open leaky gut. She was sensitive to the components of wheat, rye, barley, gluten. She was sensitive to a number of other things, eggs and some portions of dairy. Anyhow, so and she had very impressive markers of inflammation and very impressive markers of neuroinflammation, particularly some of the neurons that are involved with Parkinson's. So we put her on my program, kind of basically it's a yes and no list. Eat this stuff, don't eat that stuff. And sent her away. My PA talked to her on the phone 6 months in, and she was getting better. And so her next appointment was in person with me a year after I first saw her. And I walked into the room, and I actually didn't recognize her. Here's a woman who's smiling, has an expression on her face, doesn't have a tremor. And her husband jumps up, and he comes over and he gives me this big bear hug, and he pushes me away, looks me right in the eye. And he says, "Thank you for giving me my wife back. This is the girl I married. She's back running. She's faster than me." Then all three of us are hugging and crying. And when we look at her labs, she doesn't have leaky gut anymore. She doesn't have these markers of inflammation. And like about 94% of people after a year, she doesn't have any antibodies to the various forms of, for instance, gluten, of wheat. And we can measure these in blood. And I said, no wonder, it's all turned around. You stop attacking your brain. You haven't activated your immune system, that all these bad guys are coming through the wall of the gut and they're heading to your brain, and your brain's trying to protect itself. And this is great and wonderful to hear. So that's who I wrote about in the book. Fast forward to this February, I saw her for her second year follow-up. And she's still looking pretty doggone good, smile on her face, really no tremor. And so, and I had seen her lab. And I said, "How's it going?" She said, "Pretty good. I got to tell you, I think I'm slipping." And I said, "Well, how do you say that?" She said, "It's just a feeling. It's just a feeling. There's something not right." And I said, "It's funny you should mention that, because you now have this subtle leaky gut. And son of a gun, you now have several antibodies to the components of wheat." And I said, "I would find it hard to believe that you're cheating, after all of this." She said, "Oh, geez." And I said, "Well, somehow it's getting in you." I said, "Do you go out to eat much?" And they said, "No, we really don't. It's not worth it. It's just not worth it." And we're going kind of through the list. And I said, "And nothing else has changed?" And her husband says, "Oh, 6 months ago, our 32-year-old son, after what he witnessed with his mother, moved back in the house, and he's going to nursing school because he wants to be a nurse." And I said, "Oh, yeah, that's great." And he said, he's sitting there going, if he doesn't follow what we eat, and he's slicing bread on a cutting board that we then use, could that be the culprit? And I said, if you had asked me this 25 years ago, I would have laughed you out of the room. Yeah, right, a couple of molecules of gluten, but, having seen all this, and what I call my canaries, who are these really sensitive individuals, I said, "Oh my God, I'll bet you anything. That's it." And that was it. The son moved back in, hadn't been following, didn't want to follow. And so she's being contaminated with small amounts of gluten. And for her, that was the trigger that started. So fascinating follow-up.
Amazing, amazing. And the stories, I just want to tell our audience, the stories of turnarounds are remarkable. But Stephen's under time pressure, so I want to actually get as much information to you to influence you to firstly buy the book or find out, subscribe to this podcast and learn about this, because it makes absolute sense when you read it this way. But as I started off, sometimes people don't believe that. And then years later, we turn around and go, oh my God, we were idiots. For decades, we were idiots, just like Semmelweis. One of the things you said at the start, which was remarkable, was that we know this. We all say people act weird around full moons when their circadian rhythms change, etc. But you discovered something remarkable here that I'd love you to share.
Yeah, is part of my training. I used to moonlight as an emergency room physician to make money. And we literally, kid you not, double staff on full moon night because we just knew. I mean, it wasn't folktale. We knew that the crazies were going to be coming out and, flocking to the emergency room, and all this mental illness would show up and all this craziness would show up. We double staff. And we've known that the moon, the lunar cycles, the gravitational pull certainly influences the tides, we've known influences our behavior, but we had no idea that this moonal gravitational influence affects the circadian rhythm of our microbiome. And it was actually the change in the microbiome that was actually having that effect. Now, most people know about jet lag, and I and others are absolutely convinced that jet lag is primarily caused by the change in the circadian rhythm of your microbiome that gets literally changed off by 3 or 8 or 10 hours. And so I don't get jet lag anymore because I dose with a whole bunch of probiotics and prebiotics and polyphenols. And so I reset my circadian rhythm. And neither my wife and I have any jet lag. We travel fairly constant.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I thought we'd share a very important distinction. So how the hell did we get here is the question. And this all, we often talk about this on this show, Stephen, that we're left with the hierarchical system of war or religion that we run organizations with, or strategy that was made for a time of peace where you had a competitive advantage for a very long time, and all of a sudden it changes and we still cling to the old models. One of those models we've clung to was because the winner of a battle between Louis Pasteur and Antoine Bechamp, and we're left with Pasteur's legacy. But we've recently realized that Bechamp was actually the one who was correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've read, I think, all the books about both of them. And they were contemporaries in France. And people should realize that both of them were actually chemists. I mean, Pasteur was a chemist. He wasn't a physician. And there was a competing argument about fermentation, about where, literally, how could something become teeming with life if you just left it out in the open. And so they both realized that there were these organisms that were causing fermentation, and there's arguments as to which one discovered fermentation, but it's not really important. And Bechamp really believed that there was nothing evil or bad about these microorganisms, as long as the balance between bad guys and good guys was stable. And he called it the terroir, or terrain as we talk about it, that things were just fine. And as long as there was this good balance, maybe some guy would get out of hand, but because there was a really good balance, you could kind of overcome that good guy. But if things got out of balance, then a bad guy could, take control. But so the idea was, as long as the terrain was stable, that was the key. Now, Pasteur felt that bacteria were evil and that all bacteria were bad. Now, why? Because the French wine industry obviously relies on yeast to ferment grapes, and so does beer. So wine would go bad and basically turn into vinegar. And it was Pasteur who discovered that it was bacterial contamination that caused that to happen. Now, he was a much better public speaker than Bechamp, and he made the case to the King of France that it was bacteria that was the cause of the French wine industry going bad. And so, needless to say, he was elevated to, and the germ theory of causation of disease became paramount. But there's two books that actually independently say that on Pasteur's deathbed, he called either Bechamp or his colleague to his bedside and said, "You were right. It's the terroir. It's the terrain." I like to think that that story is true, but that actually set us on our course of the disease theory. And I think he was wrong. A lot of people in Bechamp was wrong. But a good public speaker usually wins out, particularly if you save the French wine industry.
The victor's right to history. And one of the things that you talk about here is that you mentioned, for example, the terroir, the territory or the terrain, and that is really the microbiome. But the brain has its own microbiome, which I thought was fascinating. I'd love you to share that.
There's still a debate about this, but with the Human Microbiome Project, was finally completed in 2017, we developed the ability to recognize bacteria by their own DNA and their RNA. And so rather than trying to culture bacteria or even look for them under a microscope, you could actually look for their DNA or their RNA signature. And each bacteria has its own signature, like our genes. And so when they started looking for these bacterial signatures, lo and behold, structures that we assumed were sterile, that I was taught was sterile, like, for instance, the placenta, was teeming with a microbiome, that there is some evidence that fetuses have their own microbiome. In the same way, we now know that people with, quote, leaky gut have a much more rich bacterial population in their brain than people who don't. Now, there's arguments. I go to meetings, and there's actually an Irish physician who's convinced that this is all contamination. What are those things doing there? And I think it's much more plausible that we've just not been able to recognize that we are this incredibly complex symbiotic organism. And it shouldn't surprise us that we're, a chimeric organism that consists of bacteria, viruses, and fungi. And as long as everybody knows their place, as long as there's that balance, things work well. You disturb that balance and all hell breaks loose, as we've learned.
We'll come to leaky gut and we'll come to dysbiosis, these key terms that Stephen's alluded to. But let's share a little bit more about the intelligence of bacteria. We mentioned circadian rhythm, but also there's quorum sensing, and then how they communicate. And then we'll get into actually how they can hijack our appetites and convince us to eat certain foods that they want, nothing to do with us.
Yeah. First of all, we have to realize that bacteria have been around for 3 billion years, as far as we can tell. They're clearly the most successful organism. We think cockroaches are, but bacteria make them look nothing. And they figured out, it turns out these are, and people need to get over this, these are sentient beings. And no, they don't have a brain, they don't think like we do, but they can clearly sense their environment. they can see who the bacteria is next to them. They can sense what's called quorum sensing. They can sense when enough of their kind is available to literally make a move to do something. And cholera actually was the first example of that. Cholera waits for enough cholera bacteria to make their move to literally cause leaky gut. And they can actually read what we call the barcode on the cell membrane, the cell wall of the bacteria, of who this person is. Bad word, who this creature is. And one of the startling things about this was, for instance, in probiotics, friendly bacteria, we've always thought that you needed living probiotics to make a difference. And companies spend a lot of money convincing us that there's 100 billion living probiotic strains in your yogurt. Well, most of those guys are dead. And like I talk about in the book, dead men tell no tales, but dead bacteria do tell tales. And this was brought out with one of the keystone species in the gut called Akkermansia. And there's a company that developed a way of making living human strain Akkermansia. And it took a 10-year effort, and good for them. It's called Pendulum. I have no relationship. But anyway, there was another company that actually took dead Akkermansia and fed it to animals and fed it to humans. And lo and behold, it worked almost exactly the same. In fact, sometimes it worked actually better. And you go, wait a minute, what the heck? It's not growing. Well, now we know that bacteria, living bacteria, can read the barcode on this dead bacteria and go, oh my gosh, Akkermansia is in the house. Well, let's welcome them. Now let's party. And so these dead bacteria are part of what we now call postbiotics. So there's probiotics, friendly bacteria. There are prebiotics, which is what friendly bacteria want to eat. But then they produce postbiotics from fermentation. And it turns out that the postbiotic era, and I was one of the first to write about this in my book, The Energy Paradox, was really how we learned the communication system between the bacterial kingdom and our kingdom, and what's now called the trans-kingdom communication. And who would have even imagined? Now, I always give a shout out to a professor in Paris, Marvin Edis, who really was one of the fathers of microbiota research. And I still do, and learned from him and years ago, really before the Human Microbiome Project. He always taught me, he says, bacteria are talking to us all the time, and they're talking to their sisters, the mitochondria. They're talking to them. I go, yeah, right, sure. What's the language? Why haven't we discovered the language? He said, well, we're not smart enough yet, but you just watch. We'll discover the language. And the first language was these postbiotics, which were gases, like hydrogen gas, like hydrogen sulfide, like methane. And we learned that these gases are how bacteria talk to our mitochondria, talk to our neuron. And then kind of fast forward, believe it or not, there is a society of extracellular vesicles. I mean, you talk about minutia, and I had the pleasure of attending this past year. What the heck are extracellular vesicles? A lot of people call them exosomes. And for those who don't know, when a little text message, a little bubble appears on your phone, there's a text message. Well, a text message carries information, and it often has a link. And it says, click on this link, and I'll open up this information. So we now know bacteria and even plants make bubbles of information that are pieces of cell membrane that contain, get ready for this, living mitochondria, instructions, DNA instruction, RNA instruction, and they pop these things out, and they're not antigenic, and they can go through the cell wall, they can go through the wall of the gut, can go through the blood-brain barrier, and they'll attach to a target cell and release that information and go to the nucleus and epigenetically change the expression of our genome, a plant or a bacteria. And so now we know that, holy cow, this communication system is the most sophisticated internet we could possibly imagine. And to me, I just sit back and marvel at, number one, how dumb we've been. But number two, I'll give you an example. Yeah. Quiet as a mouse. We thought for years that mice couldn't talk. Of course they talk. It's in the ultrasonic frequency, so we never were able to hear it. But when they played at slow speed, they have an incredible vocabulary. And, and we now know whales talk to each other. And I think one of the greatest things is the language of elephants. With each elephant has its name. And if you ever watch these videos, they're just hilarious. So they'll know a certain elephant's name and they'll play this elephant noise. And, the elephant will turn around and, hey, what do you want? And it's like, well, of course this was there, like Marvin said, but now we're able to, eavesdrop on the conversation.
I think this is just the challenge for work you're doing. So pioneering work is never really understood in its current paradigm. And then years later, you look back and you rarely get the credit, by the way, as well. So I wanted to make sure there was a record of this as well for you. But I mentioned leaky gut, and it's really important to understand this. And I just pulled a little segment from the book here to tee you up, because you wrote that a single layer of cells is all that stands between us and everything we swallow. The same design flaw is repeated in our friend C. elegans. We've mentioned that on this show before. A single layer of cells is all that stands between us and everything we swallow. That same design flaw is repeated in this worm, C. elegans. It's kind of a worm. I'd love you to expand on this, because as the worm ages, the gut wall becomes porous and bacteria are able to leak out of the intestine. And this is what we call leaky gut.
Yeah. One of the things in aging research, so there's this cute little translucent worm that only lives about 3 weeks. And almost everything that's been studied in anti-aging, whatever I mean, in lifespan extension or health span extension, that has been observed in C. elegans is observed in higher life forms, whether it's rats, mice, rhesus monkeys. You can repeat it. So it's become a really good model for testing almost every idea. Calorie restriction, for instance, polyphenols like resveratrol, for instance. So the cool thing about C. elegans is it has a gut, and it has its own microbiome, and it's a little tiny gut. And interestingly enough, that wall of that little tiny gut is only one cell thick. And our wall of our gut is only one cell thick. Now, the links of our intestines and all the villi and microvilli, the surface area of our intestines is at least a tennis court. Several of my colleagues in the UK are convinced it's at least 2 tennis courts. I once thought it was a football field, but so it's big. And it's all just one cell thick. And these cells, we have a game. It's a universal game. Most cultures have it, where you have 2 rows of kids and they lock arms and somebody comes running over. We call it Red Rover in the States. Australia has another name for it, but everybody's got the game. And if they break through the arm, you capture somebody. And anyhow, so these cells are locked arm in arm with what are called tight junctions. And this was discovered by a brilliant researcher who's originally from Italy, Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard. And these guys kind of hold this wall intact. Now, what's good news, bad news is right behind this wall, literally 80% of all of our white blood cells stand guard. Because if something gets through, they want to be able to attack it, recognize it as foreign, and mop up. And let's not kid ourselves. On a daily basis, foods that we carry can penetrate this wall. But if this wall is intact, and quite frankly, if we have a really good microbiome, they can actually defend against most of the horrible things we swallow. They'll be happy to take on the challenge. They're not around anymore, but that's another story. So when this happens, when things come through, then our immune system, number one, gets activated, goes to war, but it also sends messages that up to our brain, for instance, to our other organs, that, oh my gosh, we can't hold the line down here. The hordes are coming across the wall. We're doing our best. We don't have enough troops, and they're getting past us. Defend yourselves. Get ready, because they're coming. We can't hold the line. So what does this have to do with C. elegans? As the wall of the gut of C. elegans start to break down, C. elegans starts to age. It starts to slow down. It starts to be less interested in food. And as that wall breaks and breaks, the worm dies. What's exciting to me is as long as that wall is intact, that little guy does not age and does not die. And all you got to do is look at C. elegans and say, gee, Hippocrates was right. All disease begins in the gut. And what we should have said, Alessio Fasano said, is all disease begins in a leaky gut. And he stole that line from me from a Paris conference. But that's okay. He's a great.
Tanya gave him a shout out as well. But you tell us also in the book, there's 4 things particularly that was leaking through. I'd love you to share these because they'll help us then understand what we need to prevent against in the future.
Yeah, so one of the things that I fascinated with when I got into this was plants in general don't like us. They, in general, don't want us to eat them, and they particularly don't want us to eat their babies. Now, there are exceptions, but their defense mechanism, they can't run, they can't hide, they can't fight, but they're chemists of incredible ability. They can turn sunlight into matter, and we haven't figured out how to do that. And so they use biological chemical warfare. So they use proteins that are called lectins that like to bind onto the sugar molecules on the wall of our gut. And this was the brilliant work of Alessio Fasano. And when lectins, like gluten is a lectin, bind, they can actually break that locked arm, a tight junction. And then you literally have a path for these guys to get through. And these are foreign proteins. And when they get through, our immune system says, what the heck? This passport is not valid. He's on the no-fly list. And, he's a terrorist. And, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to arrest him. And I'm going to make sure that everybody else knows, he's around. So that's one thing. And lectins became part of my research. There's other nasty things like oxalates. So these are all defense mechanisms, and they're pretty good. But long ago, there was a balance of power. We had tremendous defense against their defense mechanisms. We had this incredible bunch of bacteria that go, a lectin, I love lectins. I have lectins for breakfast. I mean, there are bacteria who love to eat gluten, for instance. They're mostly gone. People who are sensitive to oxalates or get oxalate stones, believe it or not, we have oxalate-eating bacteria. We should have. most of the people who get these stones don't have those species of bacteria. So our defense system has been decimated, and I've spent books talking about that, and we won't do that today. So that's really one of these guys. Number two, part of this is antibiotics are in our food. They're in Roundup. Roundup was patented as an antibiotic. It wasn't patented as a weed killer. Yeah, glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic. Yeah. Anyhow. So the other thing that's happened to us is that, for instance, NSAID, and as a rugby player, you lived on one form or another of NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. These were developed in the mid-1970s, and they were so dangerous because they caused leaky gut in the small intestine that they were only allowed by prescription. And they were only allowed to be prescribed for 2 weeks because they were so dangerous. And I've written about how they cause leaky gut, but now, of course, they're the most widespread drug over the counter, really, in the world. And athletes, I got very interested in autoimmune disease in athletes because so many of them, it was actually because of their NSAID use that had contributed to their leaky gut because of an injury or just chronic injury like in rugby. How you guys do that is beyond my comprehension. But anyhow.
Pay a price today, Stephen. That's for sure.
Yeah.
An interesting one just to say to you is that some of the players got things like Lou Gehrig's disease, and there's a theory that it was from being on the grass all the time out in the pitches that were being sprayed with pesticides, and that's how that combined with the NSAIDs then was toxic.
Oh yeah, it's sad. I see, sadly, so many Parkinson's and dementia patients and ALS patients who either are big-time golfers or live on golf courses. And we can now do environmental toxin tests in people. And it is just frightening, my patients who are either golfers or live on a golf course, looking at the organopesticides in their blood. It's just, you're right, it's just scary. So the other thing that's fascinating is we have essentially two types of bacteria in our gut. They're gram-negative bacteria and gram-positive bacteria. And it was learned a number of years ago that certain gram-negative bacteria on their cell wall have a very identifiable feature that's called lipopolysaccharides. And these are sugar and fat molecules that are very distinguishable. It literally is a molecular barcode about who these guys are. And our immune system is trained to hate the sight of these lipopolysaccharides because it basically means that living bacteria have gotten into your bloodstream, septic shock. Our problem is our immune system reads the barcode of the wall of the bacteria to figure out who it is. And the immune system can't tell the difference between a living bacteria and a dead bacteria. It thinks it's the same. So this was proven in humans. We can take dead lipopolysaccharide and inject them into you or me, and within minutes we'll be in septic shock. Our blood pressure will fall basically to zero. We'll become tachycardic. We're faint. And unless we're revived, it's literally like we died from an overwhelming bacterial infection, even though there were no living bacteria. And the reason I mention it, the Iceman, Wim Hof, who I've had on my podcast, became infamous, among other things, because he, using his breathing technique, could be injected with lipopolysaccharides, which we call LPS, and just sit there and laugh. His heart rate didn't change, his blood pressure didn't change, and he proved in an experiment that he could train 20 people with his techniques of breath modulation and ice baths to also withstand this. So LPS's lipopolysaccharides, I call in the plant paradox, little pieces of shit, because it's what they are. And so we do not like them. And when they get into us, either through leaking or hitching a ride on fat molecules called chylomicrons, our immune system says, oh my gosh, we're being invaded with living bacteria. And so they send out the warning, oh my gosh, there's bacteria coming for us. There's lots of them, and they're really bad guys. And so LPO says that we can measure these guys. We can measure how many of them are, whether we have antibodies to them. And one of the things that just blew my mind away that I write about in the book, so these are evil. We hate them. What's interesting is the soil has tons of lipopolysaccharide bacteria, loaded with them. And roots are coated with these LPSs. And yet, eating root vegetables is really good for you for a lot of reasons. I went, oh, wait a minute. Wouldn't we just, the minute these LPSs, go into our mouth, wouldn't we just go, oh my gosh, they're here, they're coming. Well, there's some really cool, elegant animal experiments, is that if you introduce LPSs orally, they actually train the immune system that these guys aren't so bad. And I used to have allergy shots as a kid, and same thing. We start with really fine doses, and then you train them.
Nose allergy?
No, it was actually hay fever, ragweed, pollen, and grasses. I mean,
and there's a huge uptick in those cases with children these days.
Huge, because our immune system, this is actually a good segue. When I was growing up, nobody had peanut allergy. Kids brought peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to school. Peanuts were passed out on airplanes. Nobody had peanut allergies, even though 95% of human beings are born with an antibody, an IgE antibody to the peanut lectin. Born with it, innate. And yet nobody had peanut allergy. So, and now, of course, if a little kid opens a package of peanuts in grade school, 4 kids are getting out their EpiPens. And it's like, what the heck? Well, and this gets, so if you've got this great terrain, the terrain teaches the immune system that, number one, whatever is coming down the pike, we got your back. And you guys just relax. I lived in London for a year in the 80s, and back in those days, bobbies had no, they just had a knife. And because they didn't need them. Now, of course, you walk in London or Paris or any big city, and the police have Kevlar vests and AK-47s, and their fingers on the trigger. We were in Paris recently, and I pointed out to my wife, I said, watch where their fingers are. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, watch, it's on the trigger. And she goes, geez, you're right. So why? Because now what's happened is we no longer have a microbiome that says, hey, we got your back, go get your nightstick, and we may need you for a little civil unrest, but that's about it. But now we don't have this microbiome to defend us, and the wall of the gut is constantly being penetrated. And so now our immune system, it's got Kevlar vests, 2 AK-47s, their fingers on the trigger, and any little, disturbance. And we'll ask questions later. So this innocent little peanut lectin, which our immune system was taught, you don't like it, but don't get all worried about it. Now that peanut lectin shows up, and the immune system is, of course, oh my God. And that's what's happened. And that's why all these allergies are just rampant. All this asthma is rampant because our immune system is just 24 hours a day on guard because the terrorists are breaching our wall constantly.
Both my kids, Stephen, have nut allergies and certain nuts, and then incredibly birch tree. I don't know if you heard that one. And
Yeah.
I grew up around birch trees as a kid. I grew up there.
Yeah. So, and we see this. One of the things that's been shocking to me, we now can do food sensitivity tests. We used to do food allergy tests, which weren't very useful, but food sensitivity tests, we can measure with IgG antibodies, which means things literally have gotten through to us and recognize this foreign. And these seemingly harmless compounds, like you wouldn't believe the number of patients who have IgG antibodies to lemons or ginger or cinnamon. And it's all because of this leaky gut. They're in our food or they're in our air. Yeah.
But Stephen, as just kindly off air, we agreed he's going to come back for part 2 because we kind of just gave you all the bad news. But there's a brilliant metaphor, and you've heard how simply he puts this often technical information, which we love here on the show, Stephen. But you tell us, firstly, we've a badly trained militia, which is the gut, which is why there's fingers on the trigger and it's shooting everywhere. It doesn't even have any target practice. But the other thing is, brilliant metaphor, and we've all struggled from this. You're on YouTube, you click on a type of video, maybe it's a conspiracy theory. Next thing you're being inundated with conspiracy theories. And this talks to the very reason why if you train your gut over a while for eating, say, sugary food, you'll want more of it. I'd love you to share this as a parting metaphor.
Yeah, it's really true. And I go into this with my wife testing the internet, looking at wants, and true, the internet learns and it sends you information that you think you want. And the more you click, the more you get. Well, bacteria actually control us, get over it. And they control what they want to eat. And bad bacteria, as a general rule, love simple sugars. And they actually like saturated fats. And they can actually outcompete the good guys for those sugars, because the good guys actually can't use those simple sugars. And so they literally send these messages to your brain that, oh, that's what I want. And the more of these guys grow, the more this information goes to your brain, and you become addicted to the foods that these guys want. And I go in even deeper than that. And most addiction, which is good news, is driven by your gut microbiome looking for things they want. And that's good news.
Stephen, fortunately for his patients, he's going to go and attend to those patients. Stephen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find you to find out more? I'll put links to the books and indeed your podcast, but where's the best place?
So drgundry.com, my website, gundrymd.com is my supplement to food company. My YouTube channel just now crossed 1 million subscribers, so very excited about that.
Congratulations.
And and the Dr. Gundry podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. So
brilliant. I will share all those. Author of The Gut-Brain Paradox, Dr. Stephen Gundry, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed The Gut-Brain Paradox. I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at www.kyndryl.com.